So today I invite James Fletcher on the show to talk all about high performance breathing. Now, I saw Fletcher in a seminar a few months ago when he was talking about high performance breathing for climbers, and he really opened my eyes up in regards to the world of high performance breathing and how incredible it can be for improving performance in a number of different situations and sports. So I got him on the show today to talk specifically around how breathing training and breathing performance can help hikers, trekkers, and those going up to high altitude adventures. Now, in this episode, James drops a whole bunch of knowledge around this. There is so much information to get through, so it may require a couple of listens, but it really is jam-packed with info for anyone who is interested around their breathing. So that's enough from me. Let's get into it. So welcome, Fletcher, to the show. Thanks for coming on, mate.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
So absolutely pumped to have you on. As I said in the intro of the show, when I saw you in present down in Canberra around the high performance climbing, it was really an eye-opening seminar around just how interesting breathing performance can be. So I've been wanting to get you on the show for a while, so absolutely pumped to have you on. To start things off, do you want to just tell us a little bit about yourself, your background in breathing performance, and then what you currently do with Fletcher Techniques?
Yeah, sure, Ron. I started 11 years ago. I'm a physiotherapist by trade. I'm also an exercise physiologist. I was in an interesting position. I was working with Cirque du Soleil in Japan, and my mum has respiratory illness, so she was diagnosed with emphysema. I was overseas working, and then we had the big Fukushima incident. So with the tidal wave and the earthquake and the radiation scare and everything, and we were evacuated to China. And then we had 2 weeks of just partying and carrying on in China, not training because we had no facilities, and we lived in the casino. So we were with Colombians and Russians and Mongolians and English and Australian people all in a casino in China having a great time for 2 weeks. And we had to come back into Japan, and we were the first show to be back operational in Tokyo after the Fukushima incident. And as the physio, it was my job to manage the artists' health and their injuries. And what we started to see quite quickly was a lot of anxiety about, getting back into their training, getting back to do their show and their performance. Given the nature of having 2.5 weeks off, doing no training, given the nature of during that time we were just partying and drinking. Also, we had these constant aftershocks rocking the circus. So we were literally in a circus tent, and we had small fish just hanging, like plastic fish hanging from the roof, and we would watch them to tell us if there was an earthquake happening, because this thing called earthquake syndrome, where once you've had an earthquake and a few aftershocks, you just feel like there's an earthquake and you're not 100% sure if it actually happened. So we had this high anxiety, this really lots of shortness of breath because of the anxiety and because of detraining. And these really super high level athletes doing these really critical maneuvers and critical acts where one mistake could mean a life, So I had to start looking at ways to manage this anxiety and manage this shortness of breath. And then breath training popped up. That was a pretty long way to sort of get to that point. But breath training popped up, and it was purely it was my responsibility to manage these artists' health. What can I do as a physio? I was running exercise classes, and I had no other tool in my bag of tricks to help these guys out. So breath training started to present itself. And like I said before, at the same time, my mother was diagnosed with COPD, and she lived in a housing commission house here in Australia. And I had to find a way to treat her and help her with her shortness of breath. So for me, that initial step into that space was reducing shortness of breath and managing anxiety for patients with respiratory disease and high-level athletes. And that's how my sort of journey started 11 years ago in this space, was born out of necessity and to treat disease and improve performance. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's such an interesting way to get into it all, just being purely out of necessity, not even, just sort of dipping your toes in it, but it was just straight into action. That's super interesting. And then how's that transformed into Fletcher Techniques these days?
Yeah, it's working with a bunch of different athletes, high wire, wheel of death. There were some really cardiovascular athletes that were running a lot, like the clowns, and I got exposed quite quickly to a bunch of different types of sports. And what I noticed straight away was, one breathing technique or someone's certain way of treating someone was not enough. It took a good understanding and continuing to improve my learning and improve my techniques to say, all right, well, the one method, the Wim Hof method, or the Buteyko method, like these are great tools, but look at the person and look at the sport, and then determine which method you will use to deliver the outcomes to that individual. So those two techniques are pretty like polar opposite. So the Wim Hof method is hyperventilating, taking lots of breathing, clearing a lot of the CO2 and blah, 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 blah. And then the Buteyko method is the reverse. So it's slowing down the breath, retaining CO2, and then the physiological effects that happen for that. So as a person or as an athlete, like what do I do? Like what breath training do I do as an athlete to improve myself? And that's where Fletcher Techniques steps in and says, okay, well, who are you as an athlete? What is your condition, or what are things you're struggling with, or what are your barriers to improving your performance? And then let's have a look at your performance. And what does that look like? And what is your sport? What are the requirements of your sport? What are your niches? Where do you see some opportunity to improve your performance? And Fletcher, working with the breath stuff and the Fletcher Techniques has allowed me to exposed to so many different types of sports, so Canadian biathlon teams, obviously Cirque du Soleil, whitewater kayakers, flat water kayakers, BMX riders, swimmers, big wave surfers, free divers, diving athletes, like for me, runners. I just want to see different people from different sports, because a different sport will pop up a different technique or a new way of managing something, and then I'll say, hey, that's a really interesting position that you get yourself in, or that's an interesting tool that you use. I use this example all the time working with the Canadian biathlon team. So biathlons, they ski. It's like a cross-country skiing, and then they have to shoot targets, right? But they are absolutely buggered. Like they're really high ventilation rates, heart rates are going through the roof, and they get a short amount of time, 10 to 15 seconds, to recover before they have to hold a gun and shoot a small target. So you could imagine if they had a high respiratory rate and their chest and their diaphragm were moving, and they're trying to hold a stable gun, not really good, So early in my career, I was exposed to this sport. I gave them some ideas, but I took some ideas away, and then was able to give that to other sports as well, like boxing. I just worked with world champion boxer, so they get 30 seconds between each round to try and collect their thoughts and increase their recovery. So that exposure to this Canadian biathlon team helped some of my boxers become world champion. It's that's where Fletcher Techniques sits now, is listen to the person, listen to the sport, and find a breath training program that is objective, that delivers you improvements, and that doesn't take up too much time.
Yeah, beautiful. And then
you might understand, bro, I love talking, so just shut me up at any time, mate, right?
Absolutely. The more you can go on about, the better, because I think people have got nothing but time at the moment. So the more you can impart, this is going to be amazing. Building off that. So you mentioned Wim Hof there, and basically breathing performance is like a pretty relatively popular subject in the hiking, the trekking world. Like lots of people sort of dip their toes in it, and I get a lot of people who reach out to me asking about it. And but everyone who asks me is either really, really set in one of two camps, and they've either read a book or seen a video or something like that, and they're either fully into the Wim Hof breathing, or they've read The Oxygen Advantage by Patrick McEwen, and they're like fully into his stuff. So you were saying you're trying to be objective and you're trying to apply particular things for particular objectives of the sports. Like, so in a hiking and trekking world, what would sort of they be looking at? Like, what were the main things, advantages of breathing performance help like an endurance sport like hiking and trekking, and where might those two approaches potentially fall a bit short?
Yeah, good question. like, I mean, just unpacking that, what I would do in a consultation with a trekking athlete would be I'd measure their respiratory muscle strength. And that's an interesting subject in its own because there's no benchmarks. You know, it's not like to say, all right, you're strong, you're fine, you know, or you're weak, you need support. It's how strong is the respiratory system and what sort of load can it lift, you know. That has a number of impacts on shortness of breath. So if your athlete was getting short of breath going up over some passes, if that was something that they really noticed, you know, if they were really worried about altitude and, you know, if they were going to take on a high summit, we know ventilation rates are going to increase because of the lack of oxygen availability. So let's just think about that little section in itself. All right, so we're talking about ventilation and breathing and muscle activation. So we know muscles pull on the rib cage. We know the diaphragm descends. So this is muscle energy, and we need energy to perform those muscle actions. If you've got a terrible breathing technique, then you're going to be inefficient. And that's going to be even heightened at altitude because your breathing is going to go up. Your ventilation rates are going to go up. So that inefficiency is going to be expanded. So you might become short of breath at lower altitudes or at higher ventilation rates because you've got weak respiratory muscles or because you've got a poor breathing technique. You might be using upper respiratory patterns or just the wrong muscles to take a breath. So both Wim Hof and the Patrick McEwen's, the oxygen advantage methods, they don't measure respiratory muscle strength, and they don't necessarily put a big importance on technique. So the Fletcher Technique stuff, it's nothing new, but I want to make breathing easier. My whole objective is to make your breath easy, is to make it efficient, and it's to make it that it won't impact on your performance, and in fact, it'll improve performance. So that's just one example in the hiking world, is if you have poor respiratory strength or if you have poor technique, that will be amplified when your ventilation rates increase when you're going up a mountain. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. So the Wim Hof stuff, like you're over breathing. So some people would say, well, that's like training. I'm training the respiratory muscles. And in fact, you're not, because you need to put a load on the respiratory muscles to make it change. An example. So if I want to build strength in my legs, if I just do air squats, right, am I building strength or am I building endurance? So traditionally, we would think from a physiological perspective, we're working on endurance, and we won't see much of an increase in leg strength. So what we do is we put weights on your inspiration. So we make breathing harder. So we take your breathing muscles to the gym. And then like going under the squat rack and sticking some 20s or some 50s on the end of the bar, and we're taking the legs to the gym, we take the breathing muscles to the gym, so everything becomes easier. Your breathing becomes easier. All right, the Wim Hof stuff, it doesn't put weights on your breath. It just makes you breathe more. You know, and I think we'll touch base later in this topic around the elevation masks. You know, I have a particular thing to touch on them. The Patrick McEwen slows down inspiration, and they focus a lot on nasal breathing as well. So again, slowing down breathing, we're not adding any weight to the breath. We're not taking it to the gym. We're not improving its efficiency or its strength. Yes, we're improving our CO2 tolerance, okay, which is important. And I would do some of that training with a hiking athlete. I would do some CO2 tolerance training, but I would also involve some respiratory muscle strength training the diaphragm and the other inspiratory muscles, so that we can improve that breathing efficiency. So that when we do go up a mountain or over a pass, or we're asked by the body to increase our ventilation rate because we've got a 30 kilo pack on or whatever, that we're able to achieve that and not stress the body out too much.
Yeah, perfect. And then moving on, respiratory muscle training, which you mentioned there, how does one go about that?
Yeah, so the research is really clear on how to deliver that intervention. It's probably worthwhile here mentioning, I was going to wait for the elevation mask stuff, but it's pretty critical in this topic now. So respiratory muscle training, strength training, has to be 30% of your 1 rep max or above in order to make a change. So again, like let's say I want to increase my leg strength. If, like I said, if I just do air squats, or if I grabbed a 5 kilogram plate and I started doing squats, that's not enough stimulus to create the muscle change. So we need some fiber type changes. We need those muscle fibers to increase in their diameter. We need the motor units to start working more efficiently. So there are changes that happen physiologically to the body when you add enough load to the muscle. If you don't add enough load to the muscle, you don't get those changes. Okay, now that's the problem with elevation masks. So they don't add enough weight to the breath to get that change. And in fact, I've seen them used really well in rock climbing to manage respiratory frequency. So some people overbreathe and they get really anxious and they don't bring attention to their breath because they're so focused on the climbing aspect of it. So they lose some control. And then if you add an elevation mask into that space, I've seen it work really well. However, adding an elevation mask to, let's say you're a runner, right? What you're actually going to do is reduce your running performance, and you might not necessarily improve your breathing performance. So what are you getting out of that? You're not getting anything out of it. However, if you're a hiker, there might be a nice space if you feel like your respiratory frequency, so how you not your technique of breathing, like just you might be over breathing or you might be under breathing, just to draw attention to the breath when you're walking, then an elevation mask might be a good type of training tool for you to use. Because it's really clear, as I said at the start of this rant, that we have to be strength training the inspiratory muscles at above or equal to 30% of their 1 rep max. And when I work with athletes in the clinic, that is hard. That feels hard for someone to breathe in. I couldn't exercise at 30% of my 1 rep max. I could possibly walk and breathe at my 30 breaths, breathe at my 30% of my 1 rep max, but I certainly couldn't jog or run or swim or work on a cycle ergometer or something like that with this 30% load on my inspiratory muscles. Because early on in the piece, not only do I want to train the respiratory muscles, but I want to train the function and the technique. So a lot of my athletes now are training at 50 to 60% of their 1 rep max. And we, like traditional strength training, we work sometimes on purely strength and we also work on power. And we know both of those stimulus provide different adaptations to the muscle. So yeah, from the research, it's really clear, and it's pretty easy. Like this is the other sort of component. If you just strength train the breathing muscles, all I'm after is 30 breaths in the morning and 30 breaths at night, and that's the intervention done. Rather than sticking on an elevation mask and going for a hike for an hour, that could be good. That could be something that would be beneficial for you, but not sticking on an elevation mask and going for a run or sticking on an elevation mask and doing something else. I think you'd be compromising your performance and not improving your breathing. So it's two negatives. You know, let's go for a run without any elevation mask on and try and go flat out and improve my running performance, and then come home and do my 30 breaths of strength training of my breathing. That I see as a much better play than adding them two together. But again, I'm always learning and always open to having discussions with people. And like I said, I've seen the elevation mask used quite well in controlling respiration for climbers. And I could see being placed on a hiker who's going for a hike up a known elevation or a known mountain where they know they have trouble with and they want to control their breathing a little bit more. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And when I first listened to you, that was one of the big appeals of what you were talking about, in the sense that, you know, literally spending 30 breaths in the morning, 30 breaths in the evening to get a really significant training response for the breathing muscles. That was just so new to me, and it was just so amazing to hear that you do it right. It doesn't have to decrease from your training or get in the way of your day or anything like that. It's literally that simple.
Yeah, it does. In the start, like the first week, you like any new strength program, you're going to feel it, you know. So I certainly don't introduce this to an athlete around competition time. Like, I want to be working, my most ideal clients and the ideal time to start working with me is about 2 to 3 months out from a competition. So that first week we call the adaptation phase is when I stick the load on the breathing muscles, and it's weird. People are starting to breathe with a new technique and they're starting to use muscles differently. So they're going to get a little bit of respiratory muscle soreness, and that is a good thing, right? But usually when I'm working with athletes, or even the normal population, that adaptation phase can last a week or up to 2 weeks, depending on the person. And then from there, we really start to ramp up the load. So we don't add any more volume. We only add load. But depending on the person's outcome, like if I'm working with a big wave surfer or a free diver, and CO2 tolerance training is something that will really benefit their performance, then that takes a little longer to introduce. It's not a 30 breath thing. It's a time spent with lack of breathing or an increase in CO2 circulating through the body. And that's a different application of breath training apart from the respiratory muscle training.
And then, so if elevation masks are out, how do you put
No, I wouldn't say out.
Oh, not out, sorry. If elevation masks aren't ideal in this situation, I should say.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to put words in your mouth.
Yeah, that's all right.
How would you put load on the respiratory muscles?
Yeah, I've seen a couple of people do it without devices. And again, I question the validity of the load and the specificity for that individual. So I've seen some people close a nostril and, do that type of load. But again, not enough. There's a couple of different devices that I use, Power Breathe being one of them, AeroFit being another one. That's a new device out, which is really good. And you can dial in your load. So there's two different types of load. There's a pressure threshold load, so where you set a certain pressure. Let's say it's pressure is measured in centimeters of water pressure, but let's just call it kilos. So you set 20 kilos, and then you need to lift 20 kilograms with your breath, all right? And I know that what I'm delivering you is 20 kilos, all right? The second type of way that we add load to the respiratory system is flow restriction. So let's say you're breathing through a straw versus breathing through a hose. It's obviously harder to take a breath in through with a smaller straw than it is with a bigger hose, right? However, the challenge with that type of training, that flow resistive training, is it's flow dependent. So if you breathe through a straw slowly, or if you breathe through a hose slowly, it's the same load. If you breathe fast through a straw and fast through a hose, it's obviously harder to breathe through the straw. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So, if I'm in an ideal world, I'm always prescribing pressure threshold devices because I know the load, and I'm always measuring someone's strength because then I can provide them with the adequate load to get the change. However, it doesn't necessarily need to be 100% science all the time. We can use other devices and other ways to increase the strength of someone's breathing muscles. Something's better than nothing. So when I work with clients online, we do the testing, we do the training, I write them a program, and then I say goodbye, Irene, for a couple of weeks. All right, they send me some videos about their breathing and particularly things that we are looking at for that individual. So like a common one I see is just activation of the wrong muscles when someone gets stressed. So we stress the system, I watch them breathe, and I'm like, hey, Brian, look, notice that, and then they notice it, and I'm like, that's something that you really need to focus on. So in the next 2 weeks, that's your homework. This is your program, and in 2 weeks' time, we're going to catch up. But I want you to send me a couple of videos during that time, and then I'll analyze those videos and give them feedback. Again, trying to change that technique. And it's interesting. I had a yoga teacher in here, and yoga and the body and the breath has been synonymous for thousands of years in that practice. But yoga traditionally has been a very slow moving practice. It's moving with the breath and very relaxed. But I challenged this lady, and I put some stress in the system, and then I watched her breathing muscles respond in a stressful situation. fantastic breather in a calm, relaxed setting. As soon as I challenged that system and asked her to breathe again, she didn't know what to do. So for us, my focus with her is, okay, we need to introduce some stress, and then you need to use your breath to manage that stress and not react to it. So it was really interesting to see she's really good at this type of breathing because that's her livelihood. That's what she does, and she's a fantastic yoga teacher. However, let's take someone into a new realm of breath and see how they respond. Again, I'm ranting again. Sorry, Roland.
No, that's great. And it is interesting looking at all those different facets of it, because from the outside, from someone who, before I'd even looked at anything, it was sort of like, yeah, breathing performance, one or two things. You might, as you said, like yoga breathing, that might be amazing for everything, but there's so many different situations which you could master or that could be applicable to day to day. So it is really interesting to sort of think outside the box a bit there.
Yeah, it's like after my respiratory muscle training, that's I guess one tool in my toolbox regarding breathing toolbox, and then I've got sleep breathing. That's something that we use for patients who have trouble getting to sleep. And then we have recovery breathing, and that's another thing that's particularly what I was focused on with the boxers. I was like, they get 30 seconds to recover. What does a recovery breath look and feel like? And let's practice that so that it is second nature in that space. There's lots of different methods and gurus who I've done their courses and been to their seminars and learned their techniques, and then tried to think physiologically, what is this doing to the body? And only in recent years have I started to introduce this psychological component of, like I used to always get scared of the breath and the mindset and mindfulness and, like a little bit, I guess, voodoo-y kind of space, is like there is no science related to this. There's no question of it, it just is. And what I've seen in recent years working with athletes and just normal population, and the best way I find to discuss this is around this idea of the central governor. Are you familiar with this idea, Rowan?
Yes, I am.
Yeah.
But maybe you can break it down for the listeners.
Yeah. So, a cool way to describe it is, I remember when I was young growing up, I used to race motorbikes. And then all of a sudden, this one guy did a backflip on a motorbike for the Crusty Demons, and it was just crazy. It was like, what? This backflip on a motorbike? This is crazy. And then literally a month later, 3 people did it. And then 2 months later, 10 people were doing it, So what enabled this individual to do a backflip? And then what was holding back these 9 other people from doing this backflip? And really what I think about is just this idea of our past experiences, what we see, what we feel, what we've done, and what we take our mind and our body through. If it's not stepping outside of our normal boundaries, then we're going to be bound by our own thoughts and experiences. So I can't do a backflip because I've never seen someone do it before. It's impossible to do the backflip because it's impossible. I'm here, I'm doing my tricks, I'm doing my training, all within these normal sort of boundaries that are bound by science, are bound by my strength conditioning coach, are bound by my physio, my coach. This is where we exist as an athlete. Then one person steps outside of the boundaries, and then that becomes normal. So then that's grouped in your set of normals now as well. And then these 10 other people start doing backflips. So with the breath, what I see happening with athletes is they start unlocking this different potential because it's a new type of training. The way I train individuals starts unlocking this new potential that has always been there. It's just got an avenue to express itself. And that idea of that we are bound by what we see and what we feel and what we've experienced in the past starts to get lifted a little bit. So I'd like to sort of think that with some breath training and with some breath hold training and these new experiences within the body, that we can start unlocking some athletes' potentials in the mind by telling them that, yeah, they can achieve something differently because we've unleashed this potential of them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that does. And so much room for possibility there, isn't there?
Well, it's an unknown, and it's like I like I say, and I struggle with it a little bit because, it doesn't have an outcome measure. It doesn't have a X plus, Y equals Z. It's undefinable, but it is. It is a feeling that I get, and something that I get feedback from my athletes as well. Like, I haven't done this type of training before, and it's great to get some guidance on this. Let me take you through a session. And what I'm asking the individuals to do really is to be calm and to manage their emotions and to manage their physiologically under stressful situations. So maybe that's the sort of link into that central governor idea is, they might be not doing something because of their stress and their anxiety to doing the backflip. I get too in the ride up, or I just don't think I can do it. Whereas with the breath and with the practice, we can sort of say, well, this is how you manage these types of feelings. And then now that you're sitting at the top of the ramp and you're able to manage that emotion and you're able to manage that fear and anxiety so that you can go and do that backflip as an example.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know in the work I've done with some of my clients, like applying that like particular thing to the hiking world, there's so many people out there with who might have issues, and they might get that anxiety building up when they're at high heights or whether they're on unstable terrain or going on rock scrambling, and all of these things that are built up in their head. And, on a really, really, really basic level, we've talked about some particular breathing things to help them in those situations, like, coming from a complete layman. But yeah, it definitely can apply into the hiking world in so many situations, which if you have a think about, it could be a very, very interesting avenue to go down.
Yeah, I think in that space, like the first point of call would be respiratory muscle training. So if you are short of breath because you've just hiked up a ridge or you're hiking on a ridge and that's in unstable territory and you're feeling really exposed, like you won't be able to manage that shortness of breath because your respiratory muscles are weak or because you've got poor technique, and then your concentration starts to waver because you're puffing. And that for me was like working with the high wire athletes. So that was my first like trigger to get these to get into breath training, as I explained before. It was like these guys, if they're puffed, they've got to look at this wire. They've got to manage their focus. They're essentially walking on a really tight ridge high in the air. They're 8 meters in the air. And the first primary mechanism of change for respiratory muscle training is reducing shortness of breath, and that is clearly proven. So for me, and for your listeners as well, if you're looking to improve your focus and reduce your shortness of breath measures, and you're worried about having a focus for, let's say, they're doing anadablam or something, and there's a really exposed section and they're worried about that section, do respiratory muscle training. Let me guide you through this practice. Let's get a device together and let's go through it, because I'll guarantee you will have reduced shortness of breath during that time because your respiratory muscles are stronger.
Yeah,
unreal. And there's also certain techniques that you can use to reduce shortness of breath, and I think a lot of us have probably heard about those as well. Reducing your exhalation time and box type of breathing, and there's a bunch of different ways that we sort of find a breathing pattern for individuals and different gears. And there's another breath training expert that I frequently listen to as well, and he talks about breathing gears as well. So yeah, heaps of different ways that we can improve that.
So let's talk about high altitude, because I know a lot of listeners here have got these big high altitude adventures in their sights. Would there be any particular benefits to whether it's respiratory muscle training or breathing performance in itself for high altitude adventures?
I mean, as we sort of chatted before this podcast, so I've done Mirror Peak and worked with Michael Groom and Ben Kane and a couple of other I've been exposed to a couple of mountaineers as well. So I'm not an expert mountaineer, but I certainly have a close association with it. At altitude, the issue, of course, is like we discussed earlier, is the reduced oxygen supply. So your respiratory rate increases. So you're breathing more for the same energy requirement. What happens here is pretty interesting. So when you go through university and you're taught about physiology, we get exposed to this idea that we have a breathing reserve. What that means is the ventilation and breathing is not the limiting factor to exercise. What the limiting factor to exercise is extraction of oxygen from the blood. So there has been limited focus on improving the breath because everyone wants to improve their VO2 max. Right? If I have a high VO2 max, then I'm a better athlete than this other individual. But that is proven not to be the case all the time. And in fact, if we're looking at breathing reserve, even that idea that we're never ventilatory limited might be the case at sea level, but it definitely changes as we go up into altitude. So our breathing muscles can become fatigued after 2 minutes of heavy breathing. So a fatigued muscle operates inefficiently. So what about this idea that we can delay the fatigue of the breathing muscles? What happens when we delay the fatigue of the breathing muscles? And that's an interesting topic as well. So they did the study where they got people to cycle on a cycle ergometer, and they measured blood flow delivery to the legs through the femoral artery. And what they wanted to investigate was what happens when we make breathing easier, or when we make breathing harder, or when we have normal breathing, and what happens to blood flow delivery to the legs. So it turns out when we make breathing easier, and what they did was they force-fed people air as they were on the cycle ergometer, they reduced the work of breathing by 50%, or like what I've talked about in Fletcher Techniques, we always want to make breathing easier, whether it's technique or strength-based interventions. When they make breathing easier, blood flow delivery to the legs increased. And the reverse also happened. So when they made breathing harder by putting a flow restrictive device on that person, again, inefficient breathing or weak respiratory muscles or poor breathing patterns, if we make breathing harder, blood flow delivery to the legs reduced. So if we're in that high altitude environment, when our respiratory system is going to be asked for more output, if we're breathing efficiently and our respiratory muscles are strong, we're going to have more blood flow delivery to the exercising limbs, to those glutes, to those quads, to those calves as we're going up a mountain. If we have shit technique and our breathing is inefficient and our breathing muscles start to become fatigued earlier, then we're going to have less blood flow delivery to the legs. If our breathing muscles are tired and our legs become tired because we're hiking and our respiratory muscles are stealing that blood, then that fatigue in the leg is going to cause more shortness of breath. And we can see we're in this spiral now. Okay, poor technique, poor blood flow delivery to the legs, tired legs, more shortness of breath. More shortness of breath, poor technique, less blood flow delivery to the legs, more shortness of breath. You see what I mean?
Yeah. And just builds up itself.
Yeah, there's no way to change. I mean, I'm sure a lot of your listeners have been exposed to that idea of altitude training before. This is a separate topic, okay? And we all do that if we're going to take on a huge mountain. We have a plan in place to, become acclimatized. That is a super individual space. That breath training can help, but it will just slightly change the outcomes for that individual. I know, we went to Mirror Peak with some triathletes that were super fit and they struggled going up a mountain. I was fine going up. I had a hard time coming down. And I think it's just repeated exposure and those individual plans, but sure, breath training will help individuals achieve those goals. And usually around those two sort of mechanisms that I've explained poorly. One, shortness of breath, reducing shortness of breath measures. And two, we call it the metabo reflex. It's when if we have a strong fatigue-resistant breathing system, then we're going to increase blood flow delivery to the legs or to the exercising limbs. For swimmers, same thing. They will increase their blood flow delivery to their arms and their triceps and their lats when they're swimming, preventing that fatigue as well.
Yeah, absolutely. As I was saying before I got on the podcast, I sort of went, after I saw you talk initially about all this, I sort of went down the rabbit hole of looking up research around this, and I was really blown away by how much there was for high altitude adventurers, which I just didn't know anything about before. there was one really interesting study that actually looked at the effects of this in the real world. So as opposed to doing it in a lab with simulated altitude or just up an altitude camp, they took a group of like mountaineers, and I think they took them from 2,000 meters up to about 5,800 meters. And they did the first assessment. They went up there, timed it, and rated their perceived exertion, a bunch of other things. Then the second time they did, I think one group did about 6 weeks of respiratory muscle training, and the other group didn't, and they continued on with their own training programs. And they did it again, and the group that did the respiratory muscle training had like a really significantly quicker time up there, and they also had a really significantly less perceived exertion, meaning everything felt easier. And I was just blown away that like it's so rare in the altitude world that you get a real life study and to something to show so clearly that there's some real potential benefits there. I was like, yeah, this is really interesting stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, I was first exposed to those outcomes in a disease population. So that was, I mean, there's been some classic articles around that, and I was like, okay, well, why can't we apply that to different sporting worlds? You know, reducing shortness of breath, so that's making stuff easier and improving performance and improving whole body exercise. You know, that is classic and clear throughout the whole literature. If you deliver the right type of breathing intervention, you know, like, and you know, that's a real world study there. And you know, imagine like, you know what it's like. Have you been to Nepal?
No, not Nepal myself.
So I mean, like any hike, I guess. Like if you're puffed and you're struggling to make it up, you know, you're not even enjoying the environment that you're putting yourself in. You know, so people spend $1,000 on cameras and all these sorts of things, and a simple breath training intervention, inexpensive, will improve that feeling and that trip of a lifetime. You know, so that you can enjoy it and you're not like, you know, hauling your ass up a mountain and struggling the whole time. So for anyone, for, you know, experienced mountaineers, all down to the person that's going to, you know, New Zealand hiking or, you know, some amazing bushwalks in Australia at the moment, which is probably what we should be focused on, given the current climate. Look, yeah, it's really simple. It's a really easy intervention to do. Like I said, it's 30 breaths in the morning and 30 at night, and you know, your listeners are going to have a much better experience hiking in nature. But it should be around those two interventions. You know, you're like, I really want the people I work with to understand why, you know, and again, it's that reduction in shortness of breath and improving in whole body exercise because we're allowing more blood flow delivery to the exercising limbs.
So I feel like we covered a huge amount today, which is going to be amazing for so many listeners. Was there anything that we didn't really get around to covering today, which you wanted to add to what we talked about?
I mean, I've, in the last 6 years, been dragged into breath hold training. And for me, that's a different kettle of fish. For your hikers, it wouldn't be something that I would be prescribing to them on the regular if I was working with a bunch of hiking clients, because there's really no need and no space in that sport for breath holding. You're a hiker. Would you agree with me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's no time where you're ever like, you know, asked to hold your breath and do some exercise. That's correct, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So it doesn't really play in that performance space. But like I said before, this idea of central governor and finding new and innovative ways to train. So this is a new space where I'm starting to work in, and it's around warm up, and it's around high intensity exercise sessions utilizing breath hold. There's some new research out and some interesting research around release of red blood cells when we do breath holds. So there's this idea of the mammalian dive reflex. So when we do a breath hold, the body reacts, so the spleen contracts and releases red blood cells. And if we have more red blood cells floating around, we have a better ability to carry more oxygen. So how can we initiate that reflex without breath holding for too long and stressing the body? And what sort of high-intensity training sessions can we do that also utilize this reflex and that can, again, touch base with this central governor idea, allow us to break new boundaries and to not be limited by our own perceptions and our own environment and our own experiences. And this is where I'm spending a lot of my time reading, and this is where I'm spending a lot of my time working with my athletes. And it's funny, when I started this breath journey 11 years ago, there was a couple of papers out there that was guiding me, but a lot of it was through experimentation and through trial and error, and all of that comes with this caveat of I'm a health professional and I lecture at university, and I'm not just cavalier in what I'm prescribing to people. They are measured, and I want to see a result. And with this high intensity stuff, it's really interesting, the adaptations and the changes we are starting to see in some athletes. And everyone's always looking for something new and different to do in a training scheme. So I would say that that's probably an area where we can get some really easy wins, and people might find that before they go hiking, or before, let's say you're on camp 2 and you go into camp 3, what does a warm-up look like for that person? Is it just strap your boots on and start walking and you'll warm up as you go? Or is there a specific warm-up, if you are at camp 3, that we can get that spleen to contract, release more red blood cells, and you can utilize that as a hiking athlete to get to camp 3 more efficiently? There's not much out there on this sort of idea. So I love working in that space where we are trialing new things from research and ideas, and how does that look in this practical space. I would encourage people to, follow me on Instagram, Fletcher Techniques, or subscribe to my mailing list, because I break down the science behind it. I give people practical examples of what that might look and feel like. And it seems like right now, during this COVID crisis, it's people are looking to sort of, okay, what can I do in the comfort of my own home, not only to improve my performance, but my respiratory care as well. That's something that I'm a respiratory physio. This current climate is really challenging. It's I kind of don't want to talk too much about the virus, but I was in a meeting, a conference meeting online the other day, and a lot of respiratory care professionals. And I think we severely underestimate what this disease can do for the lungs. It shuts down lung systems if it sets up camp in your lungs. If it presents in the sinus, or it might be a simple sinus infection, or it might be a sore throat. That can be the presentation of this virus. But if it gets into the lungs, it is dangerous. And respiratory care for people, even in a normal and healthy population, should be something that we probably start to take a little bit more seriously at this time. And that might mean, breathing exercises, that might mean lung clearance techniques, that might mean, flushing, that might mean throat gargling, that might mean a bunch of different things, depending on yourself as a person. What do you want to do? Are you worried about it? Are you a high risk? Are you in touch with high risk patients? Do you have an elderly mum or dad? My mum's got respiratory disease. If she gets it, she is in trouble. So I've put things in place to make sure that I don't give it to her, but that she doesn't get it. She doesn't have to go outside. I do her shopping and everything for her at the moment. So that might be another interesting thing to sort of unleash, is that the current climate we're in, but it's there's a lot to unpack there as well. It'll probably take us another hour to get through it.
Yeah. We'll leave that for the next episode, eh?
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming on, mate. You've shared so much information here, and hopefully this has given some real great insights for a lot of hikers and trekkers and mountaineers out there who can sort of get a bit of an idea around the value of this type of training and thought process, and some ideas around how they can go about it. If someone wanted to contact you to find out a bit more about this stuff, or to follow you online, or even work with you, how's best for them to find you?
The website, so fletchertechniques.com, that has my contact details on there, or Instagram, Fletcher Techniques. Just message me on there if they want. I've been doing online consultations for years now, so that's not a barrier in this current climate. I work with athletes in the clinic and face to face as well. And that obviously that cannot happen at the moment, but it's probably not the right thing to do either at the moment. But that will certainly come back into play in coming months as well. And I do like that face to face presentation, but it's not necessary. I'm working with some pretty high level cyclists in America at the moment, and it seems a lot of places are closed down. Training facilities and pools and gyms and velodromes and if you can do some training at home. I was thinking, I'm starting to see a lot of online stuff come through with the training, and it just if people start following me on Instagram, I'm going to start doing some short 15-minute breath training workouts around that high intensity space that we were just talking about at the end of this podcast. The trouble in that space is if I don't have face-to-face interaction, then I don't know. I might have someone it's their first time doing it, and I might have an athlete who's done it for a long time. How do I cater for that width of exposure to breath training before? So the things that I will present online, they might be a little bit higher end, but that's okay because there's outs essentially that people can do, and it takes a little while to get up to speed in that high intensity stuff. But once you're there, you start to sort of see and feel the benefits in your performance.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I'll leave a bunch of links for all of that down below in the show notes. So anyone who does want to find Fletcher and learn a little bit more about him, whether it's on social media or through his website, you'll be able to find him there. But thank you so much for coming on, mate. It's been a really unreal episode. I'm absolutely stoked you came on and shared so much. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Rowan. Appreciate it, mate.
You've been listening to the Training for Trekking podcast. So if you've enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe, rate, and review us in iTunes. So thanks for getting involved, and we'll see you on the next one.